Professor Anthony Steinbock. I'm very pleased indeed to introduce Professor Steinbock, who is Professor of Philosophy at Stony Brook University in the USA. He specializes in phenomenology, contemporary German and French philosophy, philosophy of religion, social ontology, and aesthetics. Among his books are It's Not About the Gift, From Givenness to Loving, Limit Phenomena and Phenomenology in Her Soul, Moral Emotions Reclaiming the Evidence of the Heart, Phenomenology and Mysticism, the Verticality of Religious Experience, Home and Beyond, Generative Phenomenology After Husserl. He is a translator of Husserl, analyses concerning passive and active synthesis, lectures on transcendental logic, and his current book projects include Schema of the Heart, Loving and Hating, and Vocations and Exemplars, the Verticality of Moral Experience. He serves as the editor-chief, Continental Philosophy Review, and as general editor of the Northwestern University Press, that famous series that I'm sure you'll all be aware of phenomenology. And he's the director of the Phenomenology Research Center. Now, I've known Professor Steinbock's work for many, many years now, well over 20 years. I remember reading Home and Beyond in the late 1990s in a freezing cold house in rural West Wales that was built in the 1850s and had a leaking roof. I remember I used to put pots under it, and I was reading Home and Beyond in this house, and Oliver will come round and we talk about it. So, and I was riveted by this book. So now, well over after 20 years, I get to meet its author, and it's an honor to do so. I should also mention that his Phenomenology and Mysticism was one of the books that our reading group, Readings in Phenomenology group, we read a few years ago when it came out. And that has been, that notion of verticality that he develops there has been very influential on our thinking at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies and in the sort of the group that's interested in phenomenology here. So without more ado, I would like to welcome Professor Steinbock to present his lecture, which is The Beloved from a Phenomenological Perspective. Professor Steinbock, over to you.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Gavin, and nice to meet you, at least somewhat virtually and somewhat in person. And I also just want to apologize that I'm split between two different conferences right now. We tried to work this in, and there's another simultaneous one going on in Chile, which on the one hand, it's good that we're able to do this. On the other hand, I'm not able to be in person. What I'm going to present now is from the new book, some of the material anyway, called Knowing by Heart. And it's a movement into the project of the phenomenology of vocations. So what I'm presenting today is a phenomenology, at least a background of a phenomenology of loving as a preparation for a phenomenology of vocations. So to do this, I take as my starting point the first person perspective of myself or ourselves as beloved. And I want to try to develop it or sketch it at least in 4 stages. First of all, explicating the phenomenological perspective from which I work, and then qualifying this phenomenology as a metaphysical phenomenology, then discuss the kind of givenness entailed in such an analysis, and then finally gesture toward a philosophical anthropology of loving that starts from the beloved. And so then if I have time, I'll just give a very brief glimpse into some of the issues that, how this serves for a phenomenology of vocation. So first of all, phenomenological perspectives. Phenomenology as a unique style of thinking privileges a first-person perspective in its descriptions, in part because of its access to experiences. Furthermore, the latter also serves as guides to essential structures of those experiences. So the first person can include both first person singular and first person plural perspectives, although phenomenology is also open to second person dimensions of this kind of experience. And this makes the so-called first person myself or first person ourselves as beloved a particularly welcome starting point for a phenomenology of loving. But I'm only that first person as beloved through the other or the second person, so-called second person. In this respect, the first person as beloved is already relational and is never a self-sufficient starting point. The fact that grammatically speaking, you is not considered to be the first person reveals a certain questionable presupposition regarding the place of the other and myself. So this experience of myself as beloved may not be immediately evident, making the clarification of such a starting point all the more demanding and important. In an earlier work on the moral emotions, I described the self-givenness or the reception of myself through various emotional experiences like pride, guilt, shame, repentance, and especially humility. Through these and other emotions, I describe the way in which I'm given to myself, not as not self-grounding, and I attempted to adduce this sense of being given to myself as relational and most profoundly as interpersonal. And the expression I used for this was a capital M, myself. But this was trying to get at the way in which who I am is relational, and its experience prior to being independent as a subject or ego, who would then relate itself to others. So while this myself concerns the vocational dimension of who I am, I want to emphasize that this expression, myself, was an initial attempt to clarify who I am as a dynamic reception and as a creative originating of myself in certain ways as not self-grounding and as inherent relational. But now I think that this expression myself is wanting in two primary ways, although I still have recourse to it. First, it doesn't sufficiently or most deeply clarify the character of this relational dimension, given with the experience of being not self-grounding. And secondly, it doesn't sufficiently or most deeply qualify the reception of myself through this relation. So although it's useful, I think it's still too abstract. And this is because the kind of givenness that we're concerned with here is what I call a vertical relation of revelation. This is a term I use as another vertical kind of givenness. The point is that it takes place through loving, and so that the myself is most profoundly revealed then as beloved. So be given with the beloved in this way, and for these reasons, poses a key challenge for such a phenomenology of loving. Where do we get the meaning of this givenness as loving, such that loving would be accessible phenomenologically on this level of experience? And how can this take place, such that the so-called myself, this core phenomenon of the human person, could be qualified more concretely and personally as beloved? Is it still phenomenology that we have in mind? And if so, what kind of phenomenology is it? And what emphases in phenomenology are under consideration here? So my second section concerning the qualification of phenomenology. A phenomenological account of loving leads one beyond what a phenomenological account usually handles, at least according to many interpretations. When I discuss loving, two things are important to note. First, loving is what I term an emotion, but the main point is that it's in a broader category, a feeling that has its own kind of intentional structure and evidence, and that feelings are irreducible to feeling states. So there's a distinction between feeling and feeling states. Feeling states are static, feelings dynamic. Emotions are kinds of feelings, and loving and hating are preeminent examples of such act movements. States and conditions like being sad, being angry, even being in love, being joyful are examples of feeling states. So second, I understand by loving a dynamic movement of participating any other. I don't use a preposition for that. Participating being, rather, is a term, whereas an epistemic movement, I call it participating in being. So loving as participating being. That's elicited from this other as bearer of value. And by act movement, or simply movement, I mean a dynamic revelatory feeling intentionality that's carried out or lived through this dimension of spirit as intrinsically related to any other. including myself as bearer of value. While such an account might begin with an act phenomenology, where loving is considered as one human act among others, like trust, shame, repentance, and so on, we find ourselves immediately taken beyond this human act execution in important ways, and ways that enter into all-encompassing issues. I don't mean by this that we are thrown into speculative issues, but rather we're drawn into matters that bear on all reality, namely what we think of with expressions like ultimate reality or the mystery of emergent being. We're therefore drawn into issues that one is tempted to call metaphysical because they express a specific movement relating to another through value, which in principle can bear on all levels or all dimensions of emergent reality. Loving and hating in principle bear on all dimensions of reality in multiple ways. I can, for example, and I don't mean loving as a sentiment here, I mean it as this movement of opening toward a flourishing. I can love or hate a person, God, living beings, even inanimate objects. So let me put this somewhat differently. There are acts that by their very nature are individualizing, like self-reflection, examining one's conscience, introspection, and the like have this quality. This does not mean that they are isolating acts, but it is to say that even if you and I did the same thing at the same time, or a group of us did it, it wouldn't change these acts into social acts. There are acts, however, by their very nature, are social acts like trusting or being sincere, ordering, promising, obeying, and so on. By living through such an act, there is inherently sociality, even if no one is factually present. There are still other acts that have a religious tenor, whether or not I believe in God. So not only praying and worshiping, but hoping, for example. I won't work that out here, but I've tried to show in what way it has that structure of a religious experience, even if I don't proclaim any belief in God. Loving is peculiar because in its deepest sense, it is not only social in the sense of a social interpersonal, but also interpersonal, capital P, personal, in the deepest respect, extending to all dimensions of reality. So I articulate my general attempt here as phenomenological in the sense that phenomenology is open to whatever gives itself in the manner that it gives itself, and within the nexus of the given's own dimensions of experience and evidence. And this includes dimensions of the holy and other persons and living beings, all living beings, other than human inanimate objects and so on. This is why, in respect to loving, phenomenology is open to what we can call a metaphysical phenomenology. Thirdly, third section, Epiphany, revelation, and loving. The central problem of the book, actually, Gavin mentioned phenomenology and mysticism, was the problem of evidence. And actually, the problem of evidence continues to animate the other reflections. I asked if phenomenology could handle modes of givenness that were not the same as those given in a presentational experience, like the presentation of perceptual objects or judicative affair complexes. And specifically, I wanted to know if religious experiences could be susceptible to a phenomenological or philosophical treatment in a rigorous way, even if such experiences and modes of givenness were not subject to the same kind of evidence that we find in a noesis noema style of intentionality. So through the descriptions of first-person accounts of figures, we call them mystics within the Abrahamic tradition at least, I found that there was a different style of evidence that I called vertical, which has its own features, its own styles and difficulties. This evidence was susceptible not only to the problem of evidence, for example, modalizations like disappointment, deception, and self-deception, which were played out in different spheres of the person. There were also forms of verification of evidence testifying to the unique structures of givenness. These forms were not the same as those typically found with an objectivity derived through intersubjectivity, but they nevertheless were discovered to be historical and interpersonal. The point is that they had a distinctive structure, and their evidence only makes sense within their own kind of experiencing, here religious experiencing, such that they cannot be adjudicated from outside of that sphere. Physics or empirical psychology, for example, cannot verify or discount a religious experience. Furthermore, these descriptions point not to God as a substance, but to the way in which loving reveals itself as absolute person, and in this respect, how God reveals God's self. So before God is experienced as God, at least within the mystics here, God is experienced and revealed most profoundly as lover through the updraft of loving in relation to all creation, that is, where creation is given primordially as beloved. We can't experientially fill all this in from God's point of view. We can only have a sense that we are then as from another, and hence the phenomenological starting point of concerning loving from our perspective as beloved. I mention these considerations because the first person and second person experiences and descriptions of the beloved are received, first of all, from the perspective of loving in the mode of the givenness that I call Epiphany, which is religious sphere, and from the perspective of loving in the mode of givenness that I call revelation, which is the moral or ethical sphere. So Epiphany and revelation are two modes of vertical experience. There are many ways in which the person is revealed, for example, through shame and guilt and repentance and trust and so on. But I'm concerned, at least in this paper here, with loving in the two modes of vertical givenness. These two modes of loving, which concern the big P personal and lowercase interpersonal, are phenomenologically distinct. The evidence is distinctive in different kinds of encounters where it concerns the holy and finite persons, though they're intertwined. Because the religious and the moral dimensions are intertwined, it's common for the mystics in the Abrahamic tradition, first of all, to be turned by God and the experience of God to the service of others. And as a consummation and confirmation of the experience God in the love of the stranger, for example, or love of neighbor. And secondly, in the presence of other persons, in the integrity and uniqueness of who they are, to be turned to the experience in the presence of God. And this is why for the mystics, there's no such thing as a secular or merely humanist ethics. Or in Levinas's terms, one could even say that the face of the other is a trace of God. That's one expression of it, although it's ambiguous in certain ways, but in any case. And on the other hand, you couldn't have a detached enjoyment of God without love of neighbor or stranger, which negatively would amount to an esotericism, or in Heidegger's terms, being without beings. In order to describe this loving, we can note that loving as from another, in this case, the holy, is how I'm given to myself, or how I receive myself, capital M. And I am first and foremost constituted or given to myself in and through loving, then constituted as beloved. When we first find ourselves, as it were, we take ourselves up within this generative loving. This appropriation of ourselves as beloved within generative loving is temporally different from a time constitution originating from an egogenesis. It is more akin to what some have described as an immemorial past, or a past prior to my beginning. In any case, through Epiphany as loving, we're revealed to ourselves most fundamentally as beloved. Any other revealing act movement points this way back on its own and clarifies and disposes us to this fundamental revelation of loving and being given as beloved. What I'd like to suggest, especially where loving is concerned, is that an act phenomenology is to be grounded in the metaphysical reality to which phenomenology is open, and as a reality that is also accessible phenomenologically. Recognizing this movement as generativity or verticality or loving, the human person is revealed as beloved. Radically self-presencing and radical self-givenness is then as beloved. Section 4, philosophical anthropology of loving, starting from the beloved. The beloved as a starting point for phenomenology of loving is the personal beloved. Schematically speaking, it's possible to say that all creation is beloved, so that first and foremost, we're not creatures or creation, but beloveds. All beloveds, all creation, are loved into being. For something to be given as beloved, it is already moving within that openness of loving, such that the evidence of the beloved is only given within that movement. Thus, beloved is another term for what is primordially given through loving, whether that beloved be inanimate, organic, psychophysical, spiritual, or personal. Those beloveds who love, who have caught on to this loving, as it were, is constituted as persons. Persons are not in principle restricted to human beings. Rather, personhood can in principle be revealed through any species, precisely as beloveds who love. To express it another way, all that is, all reality is expressive of loving, again, as this movement. And there are many ways in which this loving is present as beloved, from strings and quarks and particles and elements and vast nebulae and minerals and crystals, energy, corpuscles, psychophysical beings, psyche and soul, to being present personally in the peculiar way of loving in relation to those who have creatively become susceptible to this vertical revelation, and where each element is susceptible in its own way to meaning and value for those who perceive or receive them from their distinctive ways of givenness. It's the verticality in things that demands that we go to the heart of the matter. This is why environmental issues cannot be dealt with merely environmentally. This is also why even a being that experiences the barest affective pains and pleasures, or one that feels sadness or contentment, already participates in infinite personal loving precisely by experiencing bodily pains and pleasures and sadness and contentment. Adapting a characterization of charity by Teilhard de Chardin, the vertical movement of loving carries things forwards as they are, while inviting them to peer out beyond themselves instead of simply leaving them behind. Loving is a movement toward the flourishing or enhancement of the beloved in its own most way. That is, with what I call its own magnitude or value range. It's not that God as personal loving would love everything and everyone equally, but rather let's be as flourishing everyone and everything infinitely. Within that specific magnitude, or in other words, as a use thing or a life of a living being, the beloved can become even richer in its own sphere of value. Instead of denigrating or diminishing, loving lets all beings become who and what they are according to how they are, and enlarges its scope to become this upward lifting force intrinsic to every form of endeavor. It is the expansion of richness and diversity toward unity in a single operation. Only in this sense is loving to be understood as acquiescence to a loving situation, what the mystics call surrender. But the mystics also realize God as surrendering God's self in creation, which is surrendering to all beings as beloved. When we love, we burst into God's loving for the mystics. And it is from here that the mystics especially can sneak a peek into what's going on as it's going on. The mystics in the Abrahamic tradition call this surrender or abandon or devotion because primordial loving, the holy, and infinite personal loving are neither identical nor different from each other. Yet finite personal loving can be said to participate loving. Loving as this movement is grounding for existence and founding for other acts, such as sympathy and even knowing. Put differently, from the perspective being developed here, the beloved is structurally prior to creation, such that it makes sense to speak of being loved into being. I'm not trying to evoke here a temporal priority of loving, but a structural one. And of course, one can give a different account, one that suggests that being, knowing, and beings are foundational for loving in the beloveds. But these accounts have radically different metaphysical and ontological implications. For example, the issue doesn't revolve around kinds of thinking, kinds of forgetfulness, withdrawal, absence, being and being there, but rather around kinds of loving and hating, kinds of idolatry, overflowing, presencing, beloved person, and verticality. There's a vigilance at the heart of all beloveds and hence all creation, an invitational incitement toward loving, and in this way toward personhood. This is not an anthropomorphism, since it's not the human being who is the measure of creation. The latter would show itself as a ressentiment attitude because it would subordinate the value of the holy to the value of the human. And likewise, it would make the meaning of the human the meaning of all creation. Instead, it concerns the heart of the matter, as Teilhard de Chardin might say. From generative loving, all beloveds are inclined toward loving, but without force. It's compelling, but without compulsion or predetermination, and without resenting a lack of response or taking offense at this kind of response. The sheer bliss or joy is that some sorts of beloved have creatively revealed this revelation to themselves in this creative improvisational movement of loving and have become what I term a person. So I understand a human person as finite and not restrictively individual. So the sense of individuation here is not as particular, but as unique or absolute in that sense. But it is not loving that differentiates persons from, say, animals or other human beings. Rather, it's the emotion, the emotional sphere, the emotions, and loving most profoundly that differentiates persons from human beings, in the sense that human beings are qualified as persons through the emotions and most deeply through loving. We can have a rational subject, for example, without having person. But any animal being who loves is or would be constituted as person without having to be a rational animal and without having to belong to the species human being. Even if human beings have been a place of loving, any beloved who loves reveals the dimension of person. This is not by virtue of humanity that persons have emerged. Rather, it's a radical reception or responsivity of loving that person becomes an expressive dimension of reality, being simultaneously constituted as this unique beloved. So is it possible to feel beloved by beings other than persons? To this question, it's necessary to answer both no and yes. I would say no to the extent that only beings who love, that is, persons love, but this is tautological. On the other hand, it's necessary to reply in the affirmative insofar as even the former statement can be short-sighted. Insofar as we're open to other modes of vertical givenness, that insofar as we grasp this delimiting movement and these kinds of givennesses, witnessed by figures like Marx in his critique of capitalism, or St. Francis in his openness to the presence of the holy in nature, we can affirm that, yes, I can feel beloved by beings other than persons. Hence, Annie Dillard writes, and I quote her, "Holy the firm." And is holy the firm in touch with metals and minerals, with salts and earths? Of course, and straight up till up ends by curving back. Does something that touched holy the firm, in touch with the absolute at base, seep into groundwater, into grain, and are islands rooted on it, and trees? Of course, she writes, close quote. This is not really that far-fetched or that uncommon. To be sure, I can feel conflicted, lost, not loved, at odds with myself, deaf to any call to love, and so on. And I'm not suggesting a simplistic harmony of subjectivity or community. The point, rather, is that an experience can only be confirmed, filled with doubt, negated, and so on, within the dimension of that experience itself. Its evidence is internal to its own kind of experiencing and occurs on this level of experiencing. There's no external adjudication outside of that kind of experiencing, since it can only be authenticated, as it were, in its own language. The point here is that just as perceptual experience can only be ratified or disappointed within that structure of perception, so too can vertical experiencing only be ratified or disappointed within that distinctive vertical experiencing itself. So I'm just wanted to move along here so I can get to the final some concluding remarks. When I say that I myself as beloved already bear this solicitation of loving, this is another way of saying that there's a solicitation to be love as beloved. This conveys not only the soliciting, compelling, transformational character of the beloved, but it's a yearning to accompany or participate another. Beloved evokes the received and charged character of loving, and where vocational experience is concerned, the primordial incitement, I should say, to love all beloveds, which can never be neutral. So just very briefly, where does this go? I'm trying to explicate this phenomenology of loving in part to move to a phenomenology of vocations, because taking ourselves as beloved in this radical sense means participating our own being in this way, and as an incitement to be loved, and in specific ways. How do we then be love in that way? And those are you make a distinction between like a calling and callings, a calling to be loved, and then ways in which that would take place, which is a vocational experience. And so this is already interpersonal, and I haven't developed all the different ways in which it is and how it's different from a job or occupation or profession or something like that. The one thing I want to just end with is that I'm trying to set up this context of the broader sense of loving, because such a question of vocation cannot take place within a humanism or a humanist ethics that excludes the divine or the ecological even. We could only account in a humanist ethics for experiences like jobs, occupations, professions, or even talents. But vocational experience can only be ascertained in an open determinateness, as it were, as well as in its tragic distortions through alienated labor, racism, abuse, humiliation, and so on, and most profoundly through the loving and hating of the beloved, which cannot be restricted merely to the human, and whose range is then metaphysical. So loving and hating form the background for an understanding of vocational experience. And one other point is that then it's possible also to betray oneself in terms of who one is as beloved or another, and that hating is ultimately founded in loving. And the movement of hating is such that I don't primordially hate the hated, I hate the beloved, which constitutes the beloved as hated. But this presupposes that the hating is founded in loving. But this is something I work out in the knowing by heart work, and I'm not able to do here. So I think that's enough said, at least to give a schematic view of this philosophical anthropology from the beloved as a preparation for vocation. So thank you very much.